Look, I'm gonna be honest here. When I sat down to play WitchSpring R for this video, I was not expecting to have as amazing of a time as I did. Like, I knew it'd be good thanks to the nearly 4,000 positive Steam reviews, but I never would have expected to walk away liking it as much as I do. Released in late 2023, WitchSpring R was made as a remake for the first game in the series, simply called WitchSpring. And much to my surprise, up until a few years ago, they were all mobile only until the third game got a remaster for the Switch and PC back in 2021. If that wasn't surprising enough, this game as well as the whole series was predominantly worked on by Soo-Young Jang, the founder and from what I can tell, sole developer for the indie team KiwiWalks, with the only thing he didn't work on being a number of character designs, illustrations, and the music. And let me tell you, Soo-Young Jang and his team are a pretty talented bunch because if that opening bit didn't make this clear, WitchSpring R, for reasons we'll get into, is an amazing hidden gem that deserves far more love and attention from people. So if I've caught your interest, join me while I try and convince you to play WitchSpring R. And if you've already played it, stick around anyway, I'm sure you'll have a great time here. Our story takes place in the continent of Avelia a number of years after an event called the Spring War, a battle that resulted in humanity killing the gods in an attempt to obtain their power. Shortly after this, though, the church started hunting down witches, human-demon hybrids that, unlike full-blooded humans, were capable of using magic. This brings us to our main protagonist, Pieberry, a 10-year-old amnesiac witch who lives in Black Witch Forest under the protection of a golem named Bolt, who unfortunately sometimes misses a few witch-hunting warriors, much to Pieberry's dismay. Oh, and just to be clear, Pieberry isn't actually her birth name. Due to the memory loss, she of course can't actually remember her birth name, so she decided to name herself Pieberry because she loves pie and strawberries, which is honestly just adorable. The story starts out innocently enough. After an encounter with a merchant named Ralph, Pieberry sets out with her newly acquired, friend, Black Joe, to finally eat the pie of her literal dreams, which she would have had earlier if not for Bolt chucking both Ralph and said pie out of the forest before she could get more than a bite. This is just the beginning hour or two of the game, though. Over time, Pieberry's goals become a lot more nuanced than that. With her leaving the forest, she finally makes new friends and meets people she would consider family. So with the horror of the church's actions in mind and her now having something she wants to protect, Pieberry eventually decides she wants to bring down the Pope and end the witch hunts. The plot of WitchSpring R is, for the most part, best described as simple but effective. It's not too complex, but it nails what it needs to for creating a great and memorable story with the writing. For starters, our protagonist Pieberry is easily one of my favorite parts of the story. She already wins points from me for being a ray of sunshine and honestly kinda precious, but the story handles her in a lot of great ways. I admittedly can't really go into depth as to why without spoiling you, so let me just say how her adventure affects and shapes her is very noticeable, and her growth by the end of the adventure made for a really great contrast to how she was at the beginning. I gotta say, her relationship with Black Joe after a while is pretty great too, with him taking a sort of mentor role for Pieberry thanks to his knowledge of magic as well as the world, and despite how things started out for them, it even gets kinda sweet towards the end. And on that note, I have to give this game a massive amount of credit for the more emotional parts of its writing. There was a moment early in the game so sweet and wholesome it actually managed to get tears out of me. And let me tell you, that wouldn't be the last time something like this happened in the game. Like, I don't cry easily with really any form of media. I can name on one hand the amount of times something like this has happened. The fact that WitchSpring R managed to get tears out of me multiple times is not something I'm used to, and honestly, I couldn't be happier for it. Combine that with plenty of interesting twists, and you have a genuinely great and really charming story that on its own made me want to play more games in this series. Unfortunately for me, though, I can't really talk much about it since most of the best parts of the story are things I don't dare spoil for you, so we'll just have to move on. Now, getting into the presentation real quick, visually speaking, WitchSpring R is a very pretty game. All of the environments as well as monsters and character models look great, but my personal favorite part of the presentation is the soundtrack. The songs outside of battle are some of my favorites to listen to. They're either fairly upbeat in tone as well as pleasant to listen to, or they're more on the atmospheric side of things to help set the tone for an area. The battle themes do sound just as great though, and that finally brings us right to the gameplay. Alright, so WitchSpring R is fairly unique when it comes to being an RPG, which means we have a lot to talk about. So to start things off, there isn't a traditional leveling system here. Instead, Pieberry has 3 different stages she can increase: combat, physical, and mental, with each stage capping out at level 5. Combat levels up exactly how you think it would, with Pieberry getting combat experience points after each fight, and physical as well as mental levels up after you've done enough rounds with certain types of training, but more on that in a moment. Pyberry will of course get stat increases and various bonuses, like an increased crit chance for either physical or magical attacks, as well as new skills for combat depending on what levels up. But this isn't the only way to increase your stats. Obviously you have equipment, but you can also find, buy, or even craft consumables to increase your stats as well. But an important one is that training I mentioned a second ago. Over time, Pyberry will develop training points, of which you can eventually get a max of 5. While at home, you can use these training points to play one of 10 different minigames, with one half being physical and the other half being mental. You can get stat boosts from as many minigames as you have points, but you only need to play one of the training minigames you selected to get the stat increases. The stat gains you get can depend on whether you play the minigame yourself or if you skip past it, as well as what difficulty you play said minigame on, with higher difficulties being unlocked as you do a specific training enough. These are really great to keep track of during the early game, but in the late game you'll really only need to worry about these so you can max out your physical and mental stages, because the stat increases become pretty minimal. Honestly though, if you're worried about having to constantly play minigames to get stronger, I can promise you that you don't need to worry at all. The minigame you roll won't take long to play at all. Like, from my experience, it only takes about 30 seconds at most, and you won't be getting enough training points so fast that you'll constantly be teleporting to and back from Pyberry's house. With all that out of the way though, now we can finally start getting to the actual meat of the gameplay with combat, and let me tell you, it has a lot of cool things going for it. So first off, WitchSpring R has no random encounters. Outside of story fights, every group of enemies you encounter will be placed in set spots for each area. All of them have a circle that, when approached, will prompt you with the menu showing off their stats and asking if you want to fight or not. But understand there will be times where you'll have to fight an enemy group to move forward in an area, so they're not all optional. As for the combat system itself, WitchSpring R is turn-based with a few key differences compared to what you're used to. For starters, when fighting multiple enemies of the same kind, they'll all take their turn at the same time to both not waste yours and speed up combat. Secondly, Pyberry doesn't have traditional party members you control. Instead, she has pets that have a max of 2 skills they'll use in combat. The second one will need to be unlocked by feeding them enough of a specific crafting ingredient though, and they'll only use it after a certain number of turns. You can have one pet traveling with you outside of combat that can serve as a mount depending on who we're talking about, but in combat you can have multiple summoned at once based on your current combat stage's max summon cost. Unfortunately for me though, this is something I didn't realize I could do at all until the late game because I'm a moron. Of the ones I used though, I almost exclusively used the mountable pets. They make getting around a lot faster, and some of them like Carrick and eventually Billion hit pretty hard, with the latter being one of my personal favorite pets outright because honestly I think he just looks super cool. Pets can be obtained by using the mind control spell on specially named enemies in a fight, and honestly, while I know they're all wild animals, I'm not gonna lie, I do feel kinda gross morally for basically enslaving these guys. Like, I'm still gonna do it because, you know, cool new party member, but it just feels kinda dirty. That being said though, this does finally bring us to Pyberry herself, and there's a lot to go over here. Starting with the basics, Pyberry of course has her normal physical attack, but along with that she can also use double swing for 2 hits, and eventually she can even use triple swing, but both are best used after casting a magical slab. See, Pyberry has 3 slabs she can put a spell on: basic, minor, and major, with all of them having different extra effects like a boosted crit rate, more attack powered, stuff like that. Whenever you cast a spell on a magic slab, it'll create a number of magic traces based on how powerful the spell was, and these will create a second explosion of damage when using a physical attack. Now with that being said though, I'm not ashamed to admit I very rarely used physical attacks because for my build, I went all in on Pyberry's magic. Like, don't get me wrong, from my experience there's nothing wrong with physical attacks at all. Heck, you can even use swords instead of stabs if you want to go that route. But honestly, why would I not go all out on spell casting in a game like this? Sure, I could bonk an enemy a few times, or I could shoot a fire at them, hit them with lightning, toss multiple meteors at them, and eventually even freeze them solid. I mean heck, the game's kinda built with this in mind too. See, there are plenty of healing items that have a passive effect of mana recovery for a few turns. In relation to that, Black Joe lets you use an item without spending a turn, and while this does have a cooldown time, this can easily let you sling as many spells as you want without worrying about your MP, so long as you have the items for it. Getting back to the magic slabs though, it's important to note that you aren't actually limited to just them for spell casting. You by all means can cast any spell you've crafted in battle. They just won't have any of the bonus effects from the slabs or any supporting circles you have equipped to them. Now with all that being said though, as for my actual thoughts on the combat as a whole, I personally love it. Fights are usually really quick and snappy, with them rarely lasting too long at all. While it is a bit on the simpler side of things, I found it to be really fun and even satisfying thanks in large part to the other major chunk of the gameplay. While I did die a good few times due in large part to Pieberry's squishiness and my whole not realizing I could have multiple pets out, the game isn't super challenging on normal, but hey, that's why the game has 2 other harder difficulty levels. This finally brings us to that last major chunk of the gameplay I mentioned a second ago though, with gathering and crafting. Pieberry, being a witch, can make all different kinds of items as well as equipment and even new spells by finding recipes and the appropriate materials in both the field and by killing monsters. A lot of the crafting is pretty much what you'd expect from a game like this, so I'll just go over the most unique and interesting bit with spell crafting. Like 90% of the spells in the game you use are something you'll have to make yourself, and I kinda love this. I like that with a system like this, I'm taking a more active role in Pieberry's growth. Getting new attacks like this from leveling up would be fine, but handling it this way makes combat feel more satisfying, since almost every attack I'm using is something I made myself. That being said though, some of the materials you gather will be used for some side quests, with those primarily involving the requests for the merchant Ralph. He'll have a set of different requests for various materials you can find for him in exchange for money and other items, with you unlocking new requests after you complete that set. And this does actually bring me to my only real issue with the gameplay. Okay, so for context here, there's one important aspect for enemy groups I haven't mentioned yet with their respawn time. See, all enemy groups you've beaten will eventually respawn, with all of them having a visible gauge that'll bring them back once filled. Now, for normal enemies this isn't usually a problem, but this isn't true for the later parts of the game with specific monsters. See, there's a good few optional boss level enemies in the game that always have only one room they spawn in. The problem is that these enemies will always drop only one of their unique materials, so if you need, let's say, 2 Lightnoceros horns, one for Ralph and one for making a spell, you will have to fight the Lightnoceros twice, but you won't be able to do it immediately. This can get kind of annoying, especially for the endgame with monsters like Lavastine, who take an absurd amount of time to respawn. I can't really say it's a major problem at all since you can just ignore Ralph's requests if you want to, but it bothers me that I have to wait sometimes like half an hour or so just to get a second of a specific item. Now that we're at the end here, I gotta say, I don't know if I've been able to properly get across just how good WitchSpring R really is without spoiling you on things. The combat and crafting is as fun as it is satisfying, and honestly, as a whole, it makes for, in my opinion, a nearly perfect gameplay loop that never overstays its welcome. But the story is where so much of my love for this game comes from. Pieberry's journey is one that has a lot of heart put into it, and I can't stress enough just how good it is at tugging at your heartstrings for a multitude of reasons. If I've caught your interest at all, I really can't recommend WitchSpring R enough. It really is an amazing time. It's currently only on Steam, but if you aren't a PC person, you'll be happy to know that it's slated to get a Switch version later this year, as well as free post-game content. With all that being said though, thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.